Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. What part of the world are you listening to this from? Write your answer in the comments. Now let's get to the story. I always thought my marriage to Emily was perfect. We had been together for 8 years, building a quiet, predictable life in the suburbs. I was a creature of habit, a steady job in IT, weekend BBQs with the neighbors, and quiet evenings on the couch watching reruns of old sitcoms. Emily, on the other hand, was vibrant and full of life. She brought color into my otherwise grayscale existence. But in hindsight, the signs were there. The late-night work meetings, the sudden interest in fitness classes she never let me attend with her, and the way she'd grown distant, her phone seemingly glued to her hand. Still, I trusted her. I wasn't the suspicious type. It all unraveled on an unassuming Tuesday afternoon. I'd come home early from work to surprise her with lunch, something I'd never done before. I was juggling a bag of takeout and a bouquet of tulips when I heard her laughter. It came from upstairs, soft and flirtatious, but unmistakably intimate. My gut churned. I set the food down on the counter and crept up the stairs, the creak of each step echoing louder in my ears than it should have. As I approached the bedroom, I could hear her voice clearer now. It wasn't the sweet tone she used with me. This was different, playful, seductive. "You're terrible," she said, laughing. "I can't believe you said that. What if he comes home?" My heart hammered in my chest. I pushed open the door, just enough to see her sprawled on the bed, her phone pressed to her ear. She was wearing the same lingerie I'd bought her last Christmas, the one she hadn't worn for me since I'd given it to her. Her face lit up with a grin as she twirled her hair around her finger, oblivious to the fact that I was standing just feet away. I didn't confront her. Not then. I couldn't. The rage and betrayal boiled in me. But I needed proof. Something concrete to dispel the last slivers of denial clinging to my mind. I left the house as quietly as I'd come, my appetite long gone. Over the next week, I became a man obsessed. I watched her more closely than ever before, noticing the way she smiled at her phone and giggled at her texts. I checked our phone bill, something I'd never done in all our years together. And there it was, countless calls and messages to a number I didn't recognize. The confirmation came on a Saturday morning. I'd managed to pull myself out of bed early enough to tail her when she left for her Pilates class. She wasn't going to the gym. Instead, she drove across town to a small, upscale cafe. She parked, checked her reflection in the mirror, and sauntered inside. A tall, muscular man in a sharp suit was waiting for her. His hand rested on her lower back as he guided her to a corner booth, and I felt my world shatter. That's when I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Emily had built a life of deceit behind my back, and I refused to let her humiliate me further. If she didn't value me enough to notice I was being erased from her life, I would test just how far that blindness went. I would vanish, quietly and completely. The next morning, while she was at brunch with friends, or maybe with him, I began packing. I took only what was mine, my clothes, my laptop, a few sentimental items. I closed my bank accounts, transferred my savings to a new one, and rented a small studio apartment an hour away. By the time she came home that evening, everything I owned was gone, but she didn't even notice. I deliberately left the house, looking untouched, every picture frame and piece of furniture exactly where it had always been. Then, I waited. The first few days after I disappeared were surreal. My phone stayed eerily silent. I half expected Emily to blow it up with frantic calls or messages, wondering where I'd gone. But there was nothing, just the hollow quiet of my studio apartment and the occasional buzz from work emails. I kept tabs on her from afar. She wasn't particularly tech-savvy, so her social media remained public. Emily posted like nothing had changed. Pictures of her morning lattes, gym selfies, and the occasional artsy shot of our backyard. It was as if my absence hadn't even registered. On the 4th day, I couldn't resist driving by the house. Parking a block away, I sat in my car and watched. Her car was in the driveway, and the lights in the living room glowed softly through the curtains. The house looked the same, our house, the one we'd spent years making into a home. I watched as she walked past the window, phone in hand, her face lit up with a smile. Was she texting him? Did she even care that I was gone? I clenched the steering wheel, feeling a bitter mix of anger and heartbreak. She wasn't panicking, wasn't tearing through the house looking for me. She was fine, and that only fueled my resolve to stay gone. By the end of the first week, I was settling into my new life. The studio was small but comfortable. I'd picked up a few essentials: a couch, a cheap coffee maker, and some basic groceries. Work kept me occupied during the day, and in the evenings, I'd sit on my tiny balcony with a beer, staring out at the unfamiliar skyline. The silence gave me too much time to think. I replayed moments from our marriage, trying to pinpoint when it had all gone wrong. Was it my fault? Had I been too predictable? Too boring? I'd worked hard to provide stability, to make her feel secure. But maybe I'd been so focused on being the perfect husband that I hadn't noticed her drifting away. On day 10, I got a text. For a brief moment, my heart leapt. It had to be her, finally realizing I was gone. But it wasn't. It was my buddy Greg. "Hey man, haven't heard from you in a bit. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Greg and I weren't exactly close, but he was the kind of friend who'd notice if something felt off. I decided to keep it vague. All good, just laying low for a while. Needed a break. He didn't press further, which I appreciated. I wasn't ready to explain everything. Not yet. By day 12, I started to feel restless. The anger that had kept me going began to fade, replaced by a hollow ache. I dreamed of making her notice, of forcing her to face the consequences of her betrayal. But now, I wasn't so sure. What if she never cared enough to look for me? What if I'd wasted 8 years of my life on someone who could move on without a second thought? That question was answered on day 15. I was sitting on my couch, eating takeout and watching some mindless sitcom, when my phone rang. It was her. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. Emily's name glowed brightly, as if mocking me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her stew in her confusion. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. "Hello." I kept my voice neutral, almost cold. "James?" Her voice was hesitant and uncertain. Where are you? Why does it matter?" I said, keeping my tone steady. "You didn't seem to notice I was gone." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her breathing, shaky and uneven. "What are you talking about?" "Of course I noticed. I thought you needed space or something. I didn't know. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" I laughed bitterly. "Tell you? Like you told me about your little boyfriend?" That kind of honesty. Her sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit a nerve. "James, Save it." I cut her off. "I've seen enough. I know about the lunches, the phone calls, the lies. I know about him, so don't pretend this is some misunderstanding." "James, please," she pleaded. "It's not what you think. I can explain." I let out a humorless laugh. "Explain? Go ahead. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me why I watched you meet him at that cafe. Why I saw you looking at him the way you used to look at me." There was a long silence on the line, and I could picture her standing in the kitchen, struggling to come up with an excuse. But nothing came. For once, she was at a loss for words. "I thought so," I said, my voice low. "Don't call me again, Emily. I'm done." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. The satisfaction I'd expected didn't come. Instead, I felt empty, the weight of 8 years of love and trust crushed beneath the reality of her betrayal. The conversation with Emily replayed in my mind like a broken record. Her pleas, her silence, the faint tremble in her voice. It all lingered, gnawing at me. But I stood firm. I'd said my piece, and I had no intention of letting her worm her way back into my life with excuses and half-truths. The following days were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Emily didn't call or text again. I didn't check her social media, not wanting to see whatever version of reality she was curating for herself. Instead, I focused on building a routine in my new space. Work filled my weekdays, and in the evenings, I started going for long walks, letting the cool night air clear my head. It wasn't until the weekend that things took a turn. I was at the grocery store, mindlessly loading my cart with the essentials: cereal, coffee, a frozen pizza, when I spotted her. Emily. She was in the produce aisle, picking through a display of apples. For a second, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She hadn't seen me yet, and part of me wanted to turn and leave before she did. But something rooted me to the spot. She looked different. Not bad, just different. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her face was free of makeup. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and leggings, a far cry from the polished, put-together version of her I'd known. There was a weight to her posture, a heaviness I couldn't quite place. As if sensing my eyes on her, she looked up. The moment her gaze met mine, her face crumpled. She abandoned her cart and hurried toward me, her steps quick and unsteady. "James," she breathed, stopping a few feet away. Her eyes glistened, her hands wringing nervously. "Please, can we talk?" I didn't respond right away, my emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave me alone, to walk away without looking back. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, told me to hear her out if only for closure. "Fine," I said stiffly. "But not here." She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. "There's a coffee shop nearby," she offered. "We can." "No." I cut her off. "Not in public." I wasn't about to hash this out in a cafe where strangers could overhear. "My place is close. We can talk there." Emily hesitated, clearly surprised by the offer, but she nodded. "Okay." The drive back to my apartment was tense. Emily followed me in her car, and I caught glimpses of her in my rearview mirror, her face set in a mix of determination and nervousness. When we arrived, I led her up to my modest studio, stepping aside to let her in. She looked around, her eyes scanning the small, sparsely furnished space. "So this is where you've been," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "Sit," I said, motioning to the couch. "Say what you need to say." Emily sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "James, I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand." "Understand what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "That you lied to me? That you betrayed me? That you threw away 8 years for what? A fling?" "It wasn't like that," she protested, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was lonely, James. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So that makes it okay?" I demanded. "That gives you the right to cheat?" "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It doesn't. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But it wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about me, about feeling wanted, feeling alive." I stared at her, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Alive? Do you have any idea how dead I've felt these past weeks? Watching you laugh with him, seeing the way you looked at him, do you even care what you've done to me?" "I do," she whispered, her face crumpling. "Ikare, James. I care so much. I've hated myself every single day since you left. I've hated myself for what I did to us." Her tears flowed freely now, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who used to light up my world. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, the nights I'd spent questioning everything we'd built together. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said quietly, my voice heavy with emotion. "You broke something in me, Emily, something I don't think I can fix." She sobbed into her hands, her body trembling. "I'll do anything," she choked out. "Anything to make it right. Just please don't give up on us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I turned away, staring out the window at the city below. My chest ached, my mind a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and the faintest hint of longing. "I don't know what I want yet," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need time and space." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait." As she stood to leave, I felt a pang of something, regret, maybe, but I let her go, the door clicking shut behind her. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt like solace, not suffocation. The days after Emily's tearful apology passed in a blur. I avoided her calls and messages, not ready to face her again. She promised to give me time, but I knew Emily well enough to know her patience was limited. If I didn't decide something soon, She'd push her way back into my life, one way or another. I spent my nights on that tiny balcony, staring at the skyline, with a bottle of beer in hand. My thoughts swung wildly between anger and nostalgia. I'd think about her laughter at our wedding reception, the way she used to fall asleep with her head on my chest, and then I'd remember her wearing that lingerie, smiling on the phone with him. By the following week, my resolve hardened. I needed answers. Not more of her sob stories, but the full truth. How deep had this betrayal gone? How long had it been happening? And most importantly, was she telling the truth when she said it was over? I reached out to Greg, the only person I trusted with the mess my life had become. He was stunned when I explained the situation. "James, man, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "What can I do to help? Do you still have that friend in private security?" I asked. Greg worked in corporate finance and knew a guy who did surveillance work. I needed someone to keep tabs on Emily. Not because I wanted her back, but because I needed closure. Greg hesitated, but eventually agreed. "Yeah, I'll set something up. You sure about this, though? It's not exactly subtle." "I don't care," I said firmly. "I need to know the truth." Within days, Greg's friend, Derek, was on the case. He started following Emily discreetly, logging her movements and interactions. It didn't take long for him to report back. On the surface, Emily seemed to be keeping her word. She went to work, ran errands, and spent most of her evenings at home. But there were cracks in her routine. She'd linger at certain places, cafes, parking lots, staring at her phone like she was waiting for someone. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, Derek spotted him. The man from the cafe. Derek captured a photo of them, standing near her car, their heads close together as they spoke. Emily's expression was serious, her hands gesturing animatedly. The man didn't touch her, but the tension between them was palpable. Derek's report was clear. They hadn't ended things. If anything, they were just being more careful. I stared at the photos for what felt like hours, a cold rage settling over me. Her tears, her promises, her desperate apologies, they were all lies. She hadn't changed. She hadn't even tried. That night, I made my decision. It was time to end this, once and for all. The next evening, I drove back to the house. The place that used to feel like home, but now felt like a stranger's. Emily answered the door almost immediately, her face lighting up when she saw me. "James," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and hope. "You're here. Can I come in?" I asked, my tone neutral. "Of course," she said quickly, stepping aside. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." I walked inside, the familiar smell of her perfume hitting me like a punch to the gut. Everything looked the same, but it felt foreign, like I didn't belong here anymore. We sat in the living room, and Emily poured us each a glass of wine. "I'm so glad you came," she said softly. "I've been waiting, hoping you'd give me another chance." I took a sip of the wine, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally, I set the glass down and looked her in the eye. "I know you're still seeing him." Her face went pale. "What? No, James." "Don't lie to me," I said sharply, my voice cutting through her protest. "I have proof, Emily. Pictures. Reports. I know you've been meeting him." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she slumped back against the couch, her eyes filling with tears. "I wanted to believe you," I continued, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I wanted to believe that you meant it when you said you'd end it. But you couldn't even give me that, could you?" "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not, James, I haven't." "It doesn't matter what you haven't done," I interrupted. "The fact that you're still talking to him, still meeting him, is enough. I'm done, Emily. This marriage is over." "No," she said, shaking her head frantically. "No, James, please. We can fix this. I'll cut him off, I swear. Just give me one more chance." I stood, grabbing the envelope I'd brought with me. Inside were the divorce papers, freshly drawn up by my lawyer. "You had your chance," I said coldly, tossing the envelope onto the coffee table. "And you blew it." Her sobs filled the room as I walked to the door. Part of me wanted to turn back, to comfort her, to remind her that once upon a time, we'd been happy. But that part of me was buried under the weight of betrayal. "Goodbye, Emily," I said quietly, closing the door behind me. As I walked to my car, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The night I handed Emily the divorce papers, I drove back to my apartment in silence. No music, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. A part of me felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted, but there was still an ache, a hollow space where my marriage used to be. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation over and over. Her tears, her desperate pleas. They lingered in my mind, but they didn't sway me. She'd had her chances, and she'd squandered them. The next morning, I got a call from Greg. "How'd it go?" he asked, his tone cautious. "It's done," I said, my voice flat. "She has the papers." Greg let out a low whistle. "Damn. You sure you're okay?" "I will be," I replied. And for the first time, I believed it. Work became my refuge. I buried myself in projects, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra assignments. My coworkers noticed the change, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about needing a distraction. They didn't need to know the details. A week passed before I heard from Emily again. She called late at night, her voice hoarse from crying. "James," she began, her words tumbling over each other. "I've signed the papers. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I stayed silent, letting her fill the void with her apologies. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued, her voice breaking. "But I want you to know that I've ended things with him. For good this time." "Why now?" I asked, my tone devoid of emotion. "Why should I believe you now?" "Because I've lost you," she said softly. And I realized now that nothing, no thrill, no fling, was worth that. I was stupid, James. I was selfish. And I hate myself for it. Her words stirred something in me, a flicker of the man who'd once loved her deeply. But it wasn't enough. That bridge had already burned, leaving nothing but ashes. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But it doesn't change anything. I moved on. Emily, you should too." She didn't respond right away, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then I heard a soft, trembling sigh. "Take care of yourself, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And then the line went dead. The months that followed were a blur of change. The divorce was finalized quickly, thanks to Emily's cooperation and our lack of shared assets. I sold the house, our house, and split the proceeds, keeping just enough to start fresh. I moved into a slightly bigger apartment in a different part of town, one that didn't remind me of her. I bought new furniture, painted the walls, and made the space my own. It was cathartic, in a way, rebuilding my life piece by piece. Greg and a few other friends dragged me out occasionally, insisting that I needed to get back out there. I wasn't ready for dating, but I didn't mind the distraction. We'd hit a bar or catch a game, and for a few hours, I'd feel normal again. But it was in the quiet moments alone in my apartment that I really started to heal. I took up running, pounding out my anger and frustration on the pavement. I picked up an old guitar I hadn't touched in years and let the music fill the emptiness. Slowly, I began to find myself again, the version of me that existed before Emily. One evening, months after the dust had settled, I ran into Derek at a cafe. He was sitting by the window, scrolling through his phone, when he spotted me and waved me over. "James," he greeted, grinning. "How's life, man?" "Getting better," I said honestly. "What about you?" "Same old," he replied. I was just thinking about your case the other day. Feels like forever ago." "It does," I agreed, taking a sip of my coffee. "Thanks again for everything. You gave me the clarity I needed." Derek nodded, his expression thoughtful. Not everyone takes action like you did. A lot of people just stay stuck, hoping things will magically fix themselves. I couldn't do that, I said firmly. Not after everything I saw. I deserved better. "You did," he said, raising his cup in a mock toast. "And it looks like you're getting it." As I left the cafe, Derek's words stuck with me. For so long, I defined myself by my marriage, by my role as Emily's husband. But now, for the first time, I felt free to define myself on my own terms. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. It had been 6 months since I'd left Emily, and my life was finally starting to feel like my own. I no longer flinched when I heard her name or saw a couple holding hands on the street. The scars of her betrayal were still there, but they didn't sting like they used to. Instead, they reminded me of how far I'd come. Then, out of the blue, she called me again. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting on the balcony with my second cup of coffee, enjoying the crisp air. My phone buzzed on the table, her name flashing on the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. What could she possibly want now? Curiosity got the better of me. I answered, my tone neutral. Emily. Hi, James, she said, her voice hesitant. I hope I'm not bothering you. You're not, I replied curtly. What do you need? There was a long pause, and I could hear her taking a deep breath on the other end. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. And I wanted to thank you. That caught me off guard. Thank me? Yes, she said quickly. For walking away, for forcing me to face what I'd done. It made me realize just how much I took you for granted. And it's changed me. I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. Emily, I didn't do it to change you. I did it because I deserved better. I know, she said softly. And you did. You do. But I needed to tell you that I've started therapy. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I did what I did. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to congratulate her for taking responsibility, but another part was wary. I wasn't sure I could trust anything she said anymore. That's good, I said finally. I hope it helps. It already has, she said, her voice brightening slightly. I've learned so much about myself, about the mistakes I made. And I wanted you to know that if I could go back, I'd do everything differently. I'd fight for us. Her words stirred something in me, but not in the way she might have hoped. They didn't spark regret or longing. Instead, they solidified my belief that leaving had been the right choice. Emily, I said gently, I'm glad you're finding clarity. But that chapter of my life is closed. I've moved on. I understand, she said quickly, though her voice faltered. I needed to say it, to let you know I'm sorry, truly sorry. Apology accepted, I said, not unkindly. Take care of yourself, Emily. You too, James, she whispered before hanging up. I sat there for a while, staring at the phone in my hand. Her apology felt genuine, and I hoped she really was working on herself. But it didn't change anything for me. My life was better now, freer, and I had no intention of looking back. That afternoon, I decided to go for a run. It had become my go-to therapy, a way to clear my head and reset. As I jogged through the park, the familiar rhythm of my steps and the cool breeze steadied my thoughts. Afterward, I stopped by a small cafe I discovered recently. It was a cozy, hole-in-the-wall kind of place, with mismatched furniture and the best pastries I'd ever had. I ordered a coffee and a slice of lemon cake, then found a seat near the window. As I sat there, enjoying the quiet and the simple pleasure of a good dessert, a voice interrupted my thoughts. Mind if I join you? I looked up to see a woman standing there, a warm smile on her face. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark curls and kind brown eyes. She held a cup of coffee and a book, her posture relaxed but confident. Sure, I said, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Thanks, she said, sitting down. I'm Rachel, by the way. James, I replied, offering a small smile. She glanced at the book on the table in front of me. What are you reading? Just a collection of short stories, I said. Needed something light. Mind if I take a look? She asked, her curiosity genuine. Go ahead, I said, sliding it across the table. Rachel flipped through the pages, her smile widening. I've read this one. The story about the lighthouse keeper is incredible. Have you gotten to it yet? Not yet, I admitted. But now I'm looking forward to it. We spent the next hour talking about books, coffee, and the best running trails in the area. She had an easy laugh and a way of making even the smallest topics feel interesting. For the first time in months, I felt a spark, small but unmistakable. As we exchanged numbers before parting ways, I realized something. Life wasn't just about moving on from the pain. It was about finding the things that made you feel alive again. And maybe, just maybe, this was a step in that direction. Meeting Rachel felt like the first breath of fresh air after being underwater for far too long. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged texts and met up a few times for coffee. She was refreshingly down to earth, with a knack for finding joy in the small things. Our conversations were effortless, and for the first time in months, I wasn't consumed by thoughts of Emily or the life I'd left behind. One evening, Rachel and I met for a walk in the park. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot as we strolled along the winding paths. She wore a scarf that matched the reddish tones of her curls, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "So," she said, nudging me playfully with her elbow, "you've told me about your favorite books, your love for terrible action movies, and your newfound obsession with lemon cake. But what about the big stuff?" I raised an eyebrow, smiling. "The big stuff?" "Yeah," she said, grinning. "Like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or what's the craziest thing you've ever done?" Her question gave me pause. 5 years ago, I would have had an easy answer. Building a future with Emily, maybe starting a family. But now, I wasn't so sure. My life had been completely upended, and I was still figuring out what came next. "I don't know," I admitted. "The past year has been messy. I guess I'm still piecing things together." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "That's fair. Messy isn't always bad, though. Sometimes it's where the good stuff grows." I chuckled. "You sound like a self-help book." "Hey," she said, pretending to look offended, "don't knock it. I've read some good ones." Her lightheartedness was contagious, and I found myself relaxing. "What about you?" I asked. "What's the craziest thing you've ever done?" "Oh, that's easy," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I once spent 3 days hitchhiking through Ireland with nothing but a backpack and a map. No plans, no itinerary, just going wherever the wind took me." I shook my head in disbelief. "That's both reckless and impressive." "It was," she said with a laugh. "But it was also freeing. Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out." Her words stuck with me long after we said goodnight. For so long, I'd been holding on to control, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I needed to let go and trust that things would fall into place. The next morning, as I got ready for work, I noticed my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Greg. "Hey," I said, answering quickly. "What's up?" "James, you might want to sit down for this," he said, his tone serious. "What's going on?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "I ran into Emily last night," Greg said. "She was at a bar with the guy." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I told myself I was done with her, that I didn't care what she did anymore. But hearing this still sent a pang through my chest. "And?" I prompted, keeping my voice steady. "She looked rough," Greg said carefully. "They weren't together. It looked more like a confrontation. She was upset, crying. He walked out, and she stayed behind." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "Why are you telling me this, Greg?" "Because she asked about you," he said quietly. "She wanted to know if I'd seen you, if you were okay." My first instinct was to tell him I didn't care, that her life wasn't my business anymore. But a part of me, a small, stubborn part, couldn't help wondering what had happened between them. "Thanks for letting me know," I said finally. "But I don't think I need to get involved." "Fair enough," Greg said. "I just thought you should hear from me." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing. I didn't want to get sucked back into her chaos, but the lingering questions gnawed at me. Had she finally ended things with him? Was she really trying to change? Or was this just another chapter in her messy web of lies? Later that day, I got a text from Rachel. "Hey, lemon cake tomorrow? My treat this time." Smiling face with smiling eyes. Her message brought a smile to my face. Whatever Emily was going through, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had my own life to focus on, my own path to rebuild. And Rachel was quickly becoming a bright spot in that journey. "Sounds perfect," I replied. "What time?" As I hit send, I felt a sense of clarity. Emily's choices were hers to deal with. I wasn't going to let her mistakes define me any longer. My future was mine to shape, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Meeting Rachel for coffee the next day felt like a breath of fresh air. She waved as I entered the cafe, her smile warm, and welcoming. The tiny table we always gravitated toward had already been claimed, with 2 steaming mugs and a slice of lemon cake waiting for me. "I couldn't resist," she said, gesturing to the cake. "Figured we'd split it. You're starting to know me too well," I teased, sitting down. "If you keep this up, I'll have to start running twice a day." She laughed, and the sound felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. We spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing: her job as a graphic designer, my attempts to learn guitar again, and a hilarious story about her disastrous attempt at baking a pie the night before. Being around Rachel made the weight of the past feel lighter. She didn't push or pry. She just listened, laughed, and made me feel like I was worth knowing. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe I deserved this kind of peace, this kind of connection. That evening, as I sat in my apartment scrolling mindlessly through streaming options, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "James, I need to talk to you. Please." I stared at the message for a long moment, my stomach twisting. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave her words unanswered like I had before. But another part, the part that still remembered the good years, felt compelled to at least hear her out. Against my better judgment, I replied. "What is it?" Her response came almost immediately. "Can we meet? Just once. I won't take much of your time. I owe you an explanation." I leaned back on the couch, running a hand through my hair. An explanation? After everything that had happened. Did I even want one? Did it matter anymore? I thought about Rachel and the calm, steady happiness I was beginning to feel with her. I thought about how far I'd come since leaving Emily. And then I thought about the part of me that still had questions, still craved closure. Finally, I texted back. "Fine. Tomorrow evening. Same cafe where we used to go." Her reply was immediate. "Thank you." The next day, I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, nerves simmering beneath the surface. Emily was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window. She looked different, thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes. As I approached, she glanced up, her face softening with what looked like relief. "Hi, James," she said quietly, standing to greet me. "Emily," I replied, taking the seat across from her. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk." She fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her gaze dropping to the table. "First, I just want to say I'm sorry again. For everything. For how I hurt you." "I've heard that already," I said, keeping my tone steady. "What's different now?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "You're right. You deserve the truth. All of it." For the next 20 minutes, Emily laid everything bare. She admitted that her relationship with him, his name was Mark, had lasted longer than she initially let on. They'd started flirting over a year before I discovered them, but it had only turned physical a few months before I left. She told me about the thrill she felt at first, the rush of something new and forbidden. But she also admitted that it didn't take long for the thrill to fade. Mark was manipulative, demanding, and prone to mood swings. By the time I caught on, she said she'd already started to regret the affair, but didn't know how to stop. "I was a coward," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I should have come clean. I should have begged you to forgive me and cut him off right then. But instead, I kept lying. And I lost you." I listened in silence, my emotions churning. Part of me felt vindicated, hearing her admit the truth. But another part felt an ache I couldn't quite name, a sadness for what we'd lost, for what could have been if she'd made different choices. "Why now?" I asked finally. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't live with the guilt anymore," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "I needed you to know the truth. And I needed you to know that. I'm sorry, I didn't realize what I had until it was gone." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window as I processed everything she'd said. The anger I'd carried for months felt distant now, replaced by something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a sense of release. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally, my voice calm. "I think I needed to hear it." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I won't bother you again, James. I promise. I hope you find someone who makes you happy. Someone who deserves you." Her words echoed in my mind as I left the cafe. For the first time since our marriage had crumbled, I felt like I could truly let go. The weight of her betrayal, the bitterness and pain. It didn't define me anymore. I went home that night and texted Rachel. "Dinner this weekend? My treat." Her response came quickly. "Absolutely. Can't wait." Smiling face with smiling eyes. As I put my phone down, a small smile crept onto my face. My past with Emily was over. My future, I realized, was just beginning. The dinner with Rachel that weekend felt like a milestone, a turning point I hadn't realized I was waiting for. We went to a cozy Italian restaurant, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that felt intimate without trying too hard. The glow of the candlelight on our table reflected her warm smile. And for the first time, I felt entirely present, unburdened by the shadows of my past. "So," Rachel said, twirling her fork in a plate of linguine, "what's next for James?" "What do you mean?" I asked, sipping my wine. "You've made a clean break. Started fresh," she said, gesturing around the restaurant as if to emphasize my progress. "What's next on the horizon? Any big plans, dreams, bucket list items?" I leaned back in my chair, considering her question. For so long, my life had been about repairing the damage Emily left behind, clawing my way back to some semblance of normalcy. But now, with the worst behind me, I realized I hadn't thought much about the future. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I'm still figuring that out. But I think I want to start traveling again. See some places I've always dreamed about." Her face lit up. "I love that. Where's the first stop?" "Maybe Italy," I said, smiling as I gestured to our surroundings. "Seems fitting, doesn't it?" Rachel laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Italy's amazing. You'd love it. Rome, Florence, Venice. And don't even get me started on the food." "Have you been?" I asked. "Once," she said, her voice softening with nostalgia. "Years ago, but I'd go back in a heartbeat." As the conversation flowed, I found myself imagining the possibility of sharing that experience with her someday. Not as a grand plan, but as a quiet hope. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel daunting. It felt open, full of promise. A few days later, life threw me an unexpected curveball. I was at work, wrapping up a meeting with my team, when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello," I said, stepping out of the conference room. "James?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but steady. "This is Christy. I'm a friend of Emily's." I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. "What do you want?" "I know this is out of the blue," she said quickly, her tone apologetic. "But Emily's not doing well. I thought you should know." "What do you mean, not doing well?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "She's been struggling," Christy said, choosing her words carefully. "With everything that happened between you two, and with Mark, things ended badly there, and she's having a hard time coping." I didn't know how to respond. A part of me felt like this wasn't my problem anymore. I'd given Emily more than enough of my time, my patience, my heart. But another part, a quieter, more compassionate part, remembered the woman she used to be before everything fell apart. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. "Because I think she needs closure," Christy said. "And honestly, I think you might need it too. She's not asking for anything. She just misses the person you were to each other." The conversation left me shaken. I spent the rest of the day distracted, replaying Christy's words in my mind. I didn't want to reopen old wounds, but the thought of Emily spiraling weighed on me. Could I really ignore it, knowing what I knew now? That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights twinkle, I made my decision. I didn't know Emily anything, but I owed myself the chance to lay everything to rest for good. A few days later, I met Emily at the same cafe where we'd talked before. She looked even more fragile than the last time. Her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her clothes hanging off her thin frame. But her eyes met mine with a kind of quiet determination. "Thank you for coming," she said softly as I sat down. "What's going on, Emily?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said finally. "About us. About what I did. And I needed to see you. To tell you that I understand now, truly, how much I hurt you." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Emily, I appreciate the apology. But we've been through this already. What are you hoping to get out of this?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "Nothing," she said firmly. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry, and that I hope you find someone who makes you happy." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that felt different this time. Genuine. Final. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something close to forgiveness. Not for her sake, but for mine. Holding on to the anger had protected me for so long, but now it felt like an anchor I no longer needed. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I hope you find peace, Emily." She nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. As I stood to leave, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a door had finally closed. That evening, I called Rachel. We met for a walk in the park, the air crisp and the stars beginning to peek through the sky. "How are you?" she asked, her voice full of warmth and curiosity. "Better," I said honestly. "I think I finally got the closure I needed." She smiled, slipping her arm through mine as we walked. "Good. You deserve it." For the first time, I truly believed her. My past with Emily was a chapter I'd closed. Now, I was ready to start writing a new one. Weeks passed, and the sense of closure from my final meeting with Emily felt like a new beginning. The weight of her betrayal no longer clung to me like it used to. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to thrive. Rachel played a big role in that. She and I weren't rushing into anything, but there was an undeniable connection between us, one that grew stronger with each passing day. Our conversations were effortless, her laughter infectious, and the warmth in her eyes made it easy to forget the pain I'd carried for so long. One evening, as we sat on my couch watching a cheesy rom-com, Rachel turned to me with a curious expression. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. What's the hardest thing about starting over?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze steady. I thought about it for a moment, staring at the glass of wine in my hand. "Letting go?" I said finally. "Not just of the person, but of the life you thought you were going to have. The future you pictured for so long." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense, but it seems like you've done a pretty good job of it." I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. It wasn't easy. There were a lot of nights when I thought I'd never get here. But I guess at some point, I realized I could either let the past define me, or I could move forward. Rachel reached over, placing her hand on mine. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice." Her touch sent a warmth through me that felt new and unfamiliar, but good. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I might be gaining. A few days later, I got a call from Greg. We hadn't spoken much since I'd finalized my divorce, so I was surprised to see his name on my screen. "Hey man," I said. "What's up?" "I just wanted to check in," he said. "You've been quiet lately. How's life?" "Good," I said honestly. "Really good, actually." "Glad to hear it," Greg said, his tone light. "So, does this have anything to do with that woman you've been seeing?" I laughed. "Word travels fast." "Small world," he said. "Someone mentioned they saw you with her at the park the other day. She seems great." "She is," I admitted, a smile tugging at my lips. I wasn't sure I was ready for anything serious, but with Rachel, it just feels easy. "Sounds like you're in a good place," Greg said. "And after everything you've been through, you deserve that." His words stuck with me long after we hung up. For so long, I'd felt defined by the pain Emily had caused, by the life we'd built and lost. But now, I was starting to feel like a new version of myself, one that wasn't tied to the past. That weekend, Rachel and I went on a hike just outside the city. The trail wound through a dense forest, the air crisp and fresh with the scent of pine. We stopped at a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below, the trees a patchwork of autumn colors. "This is incredible," Rachel said, her eyes wide as she took in the view. "How did you find this place?" "I used to come here when I needed to think," I said. "It's peaceful, quiet." She turned to me, a soft smile on her face. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "Yeah, I think I have." As we stood there, side by side, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't dwelling on the hurt or the betrayal or the life I'd left behind. I was looking forward to the possibilities, to the life I was building, to the person standing next to me. I'm glad I met you, I said, my voice quiet but certain. Rachel looked up at me, her eyes shining. I'm glad I met you too. In that moment, I knew I was finally free, not just from Emily, but from the weight of everything that had held me back. My past was a part of me, but it didn't define me. I was ready to move forward, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Over the next few weeks, my relationship with Rachel deepened in ways I hadn't expected. We weren't rushing anything, but every conversation, every shared meal, and every quiet moment together felt like we were building something meaningful, something real. One Friday evening, as we were finishing dinner at my place, Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "What's on your mind?" I asked, pouring her another glass of wine. "Have you thought about seeing Emily again?" she asked carefully. Her question caught me off guard, but there was no judgment in her tone, just curiosity. "No," I said after a moment. "I mean, I saw her recently for closure, but beyond that, there's nothing left to say." Rachel nodded, swirling her wine in her glass. "I get that. I just wondered if there was anything unresolved for you." "There's not," I said firmly. "I've made peace with it. What happened with Emily taught me a lot about myself. What I want, what I deserve. But I don't need to go back there." Rachel smiled softly. "Good. I just wanted to make sure you weren't carrying any of that with you, because you seem like someone who's ready to move forward." "I am," I said, meeting her gaze. "And a big part of that is because of you." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she reached across the table to take my hand. "Well, I think we're doing a pretty good job of figuring it out together." The next morning, I woke up to a message from Greg. "Mun, just heard something you might want to know. Call me when you can." I dialed him immediately, my stomach knotting with unease. "What's going on?" I asked as soon as he picked up. "It's about Emily," he said, his tone cautious. "I ran into Christy again, her friend. She mentioned that Emily's been struggling more than she let on." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice tightening. "She's been isolating herself," Greg said carefully. "Barely leaving the house, not answering calls. Christy thinks she might need help, but doesn't know how to get through to her." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my thoughts swirling. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know you," Greg said. "You're not the kind of guy to just walk away without making sure she's okay." "She's not my responsibility anymore," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "No, she's not," Greg agreed. "But that doesn't mean you can't check in. If nothing else, it might give her the push she needs to get help." After we hung up, I sat in silence, wrestling with the decision. On one hand, I'd worked hard to put Emily behind me. On the other, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared, however faintly, about her well-being. That evening, I decided to stop by Emily's place. It was a calculated risk, one I wasn't entirely comfortable with, but I told myself it was the right thing to do. When she answered the door, she looked surprised and exhausted. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "Christy mentioned you've been having a hard time," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." She stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. The house was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of forgotten dishes and unopened windows. It was a far cry from the meticulously kept home we'd once shared. "I'm sorry for the mess," she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. "I haven't exactly been functioning." "Emily," I said gently, sitting across from her. "What's going on?" She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling as she spoke. "After you left, I thought I'd be fine. I told myself I didn't need you, that I'd be better off on my own. But I was wrong." Her confession was raw, and for the first time, I saw the full extent of the pain she was carrying, not just from losing me, but from the choices she'd made that led us here. "I've been trying to fix myself," she continued. "Therapy, cutting ties with toxic people, but some days it feels like I'm drowning." I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "Emily, you don't have to do this alone, but you need to keep moving forward. You need to want to heal." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Ido, James, I really do." "Then let people help you," I said. "Christy cares about you." Your therapist cares about you. Lean on them. Let them support you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, but I knew I couldn't stay in her orbit any longer. I'd done what I could, and now it was up to her to take the next step. I hope you find peace, Emily, I said as I stood to leave. I really do. She didn't stop me, and as I walked out the door, I felt a sense of finality I hadn't expected. This time, there were no lingering doubts, no unresolved feelings, just the quiet assurance that I'd done my part. That night, I told Rachel about my visit. Do you regret going? She asked, her voice soft. No, I said honestly. I think it was the right thing to do. But now, I'm ready to leave it behind. For good. Rachel smiled, her hand resting on mine. Then that's exactly what you should do. As we sat together in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something. My past with Emily was no longer a weight holding me down. It was a chapter that had ended, and the story I was writing now, with Rachel, with myself, was one I was finally excited to live. In the weeks following my final visit to Emily, my life began to settle into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years, steady, fulfilling, and above all, peaceful. The echoes of my old life no longer haunted me, and the choices I'd made felt like distant ripples on a pond. Rachel was becoming a constant in my life, not in a way that felt rushed, but in a way that felt natural. One Friday evening, she invited me over to her place for dinner. It was the first time I'd see where she lived, and I was both excited and nervous. I showed up with a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers, feeling like a teenager on a first date. Her apartment was as warm and inviting as she was. Soft lighting, cozy furniture, and little touches that reflected her personality. A shelf lined with books, a gallery wall of photos from her travels, and a pair of mismatched mugs on the counter that made me smile. This is perfect, I said as she led me into the kitchen, where the scent of something delicious filled the air. Thanks, she said, flashing me a grin as she stirred a pot on the stove. It's small, but it's home. We sat down to a simple but incredible meal of homemade pasta and garlic bread, the kind of dinner that reminded me how much I love the little moments. Afterward, we moved to her couch, where she curled up beside me with a blanket and a mug of tea. Can I ask you something? She said after a while, her voice soft. Of course, I replied, running my fingers through her curls. Do you ever think about the kind of life you want now? Like, what you see for yourself in the future? I thought about her question, letting the silence stretch. Honestly, I don't know if I have a perfect picture of the future anymore, I said. But I think that's okay. Right now, I just want to be happy, to surround myself with people who make me feel alive. Everything else will come when it's meant to. Her smile widened, and she rested her head on my shoulder. That's a good answer. What about you? I asked, glancing down at her. She chuckled. Oh, I have all kinds of plans. More traveling, maybe getting a dog. But mostly I want to build a life that feels honest. Real. That's a plan I can get behind, I said, squeezing her hand. As the months passed, Rachel and I grew closer. We went on hikes, tried new restaurants, and spent lazy Sundays binge-watching crime documentaries. I introduced her to Greg, who immediately approved, and she dragged me to meet her best friend, Zoe, who grilled me relentlessly before finally giving her blessing. "You got a good one here," Zoe said, clapping me on the shoulder as we left. "Don't mess it up." "I'll do my best," I replied with a grin. Rachel became a part of my life in a way that felt effortless. And for the first time, I felt like I was building something worth holding on to. It wasn't a replacement for what I'd lost. It was something entirely new, something better. Then one evening, Rachel surprised me. We were walking through the park, the air crisp and cool under a canopy of stars. She stopped suddenly, turning to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. "Nothing," she said, smiling nervously. I wanted to say something important." "Okay," I said, giving her my full attention. She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting slightly. "I know we've both been taking things slow, and I love that about us. But I need you to know how much I care about you, James. You've become such a big part of my life, and I can't imagine not having you in it." Her words hit me with a force I hadn't expected, not because they were surprising, but because they felt so deeply right. I reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "I feel the same way," I said, my voice steady. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready for this, but with you, it's different. You've made me believe in something I thought I'd lost forever." Her smile was radiant, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You really mean that?" "Every word," I said, pulling her into a hug. In that moment, standing under the stars with Rachel in my arms, I realized something. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The conversation with Rachel that night stayed with me. For the first time since my marriage had ended, I felt like I was truly rebuilding, not just picking up the pieces of my old life, but creating something entirely new. And Rachel wasn't just part of that process. She was central to it. A few weeks later, she invited me to join her on a weekend trip to a nearby cabin. It was a spur-of-the-moment idea, something she'd booked impulsively after finding a great deal online. "It'll be fun," she said, her excitement infectious. "Just the two of us, surrounded by nature. No distractions." I agreed, not realizing just how much I needed the getaway until we were driving up a winding mountain road, the city fading into the distance. The cabin was perfect, rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and a view of a crystal-clear lake. Rachel immediately claimed the kitchen. Unpacking ingredients for a dinner she insisted on cooking herself. As she worked, I lit a fire, the warmth and crackle filling the cozy space. By the time dinner was ready, pan-seared salmon with roasted vegetables and a bottle of wine, the cabin felt like a little pocket of serenity, far removed from the chaos of everyday life. After dinner, we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa. The stars were impossibly bright, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Rachel leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "This," she said softly, "is exactly what I needed." "Me too," I admitted, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for bringing me here." She tilted her face up to look at me, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Do you ever feel like we were meant to find each other? Like everything that happened, good and bad, was leading us here?" Her words struck a chord deep within me. I'd spent so much time questioning the pain of my past, the choices I'd made, and the betrayal I'd endured. But sitting there with Rachel, I realized that every twist and turn had brought me to this moment. And for the first time, I felt at peace with all of it. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Ido." The next morning, we went for a hike along one of the trails near the cabin. The air was crisp and cool, the ground carpeted with fallen leaves and shades of gold and crimson. Rachel led the way, her energy boundless as she pointed out little details, a cluster of wildflowers, the sound of a babbling brook. I couldn't help but smile, her enthusiasm infectious. When we reached the top of the trail, the view took my breath away. The lake stretched out below us, shimmering in the sunlight, surrounded by dense forests and distant peaks. Rachel stood beside me, her cheeks flushed from the climb, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is," I agreed, though I wasn't looking at the lake. I was looking at her. She caught me staring and laughed, nudging me playfully. "What?" "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just glad you're here." Her smile softened, and she reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. "Me too." We stayed there for a while, soaking in the view and the quiet. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt perfectly aligned, as if the universe had paused just for us. On the drive back to the city, we talked about everything and nothing, our favorite movies, childhood memories, and dreams for the future. Rachel confessed that she'd always wanted to open a little bookstore cafe, a cozy space where people could lose themselves in stories and good coffee. "You'd be great at that," I said, picturing her in a sunlit shop, surrounded by books and laughter. "I'd be your first customer." "You'd have to be," she teased. "I need someone to test all the pastries." As the miles rolled by, I found myself imagining what life might look like if we kept building together. Weekends like this, lazy mornings in bed, shared adventures. It was a future I hadn't dared to picture before, but now it felt within reach. When we finally pulled into her driveway, Rachel turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for coming with me," she said. "This weekend was everything." It was, I agreed, leaning over to kiss her. "And it won't be the last." Her smile was radiant, and as I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how far I'd come. The pain of my past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was building something new, something better, and for the first time I felt truly ready for it. Over the next few months, life with Rachel became something I looked forward to in ways I hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just my partner. She was my anchor, the steady presence that reminded me what it felt like to be truly seen and appreciated. We fell into an easy routine. Weekday dinners, weekend adventures, and quiet nights spent reading or talking. She introduced me to her family, a lively bunch who welcomed me with open arms and plenty of questions. I brought her to meet Greg and his wife, who took to her immediately. "She's a keeper," Greg told me later that night, clapping me on the back. "Don't screw this up, man." "I don't plan to," I said with a smile. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Rachel and I were walking through the farmer's market, bundled up in coats and scarves. The air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and fresh bread, and the chatter of vendors mingled with the hum of holiday shoppers. As we passed a stall selling handmade pottery, Rachel stopped to admire a set of mugs. She picked one up, running her fingers over the smooth glaze. "These are beautiful," she said, holding it up for me to see. "Don't you think?" "They are," I agreed. "Do you want one?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Maybe next time. They're a little pricey." I smiled, making a mental note to come back and buy it for her later. Rachel had a way of appreciating the little things, and I loved finding ways to surprise her. As we continued walking, we stopped at a booth selling fresh pastries. Rachel ordered a croissant, and as she turned to me with a playful smile, I felt a sudden urge to tell her something I'd been holding back. "I love you," I said, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at me. Then, her face broke into a radiant smile, and she stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "I love you too." Hearing her say it felt like stepping into sunlight after a long, dark winter. The words weren't rushed or forced. They were honest, real, and exactly what I needed to hear. As Rachel and I grew closer, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. There were moments of doubt, fleeting thoughts about whether I deserved this happiness after everything that had happened. But Rachel never let me linger in those doubts for long. She had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that I wasn't defined by my past. One evening, as we sat on her couch watching a documentary about art thieves, Rachel turned to me with a curious expression. "Have you ever thought about what you'd say to your younger self?" she asked. "Like if you could go back and give yourself advice, what would it be?" I thought about it for a moment, my gaze fixed on the flickering screen. "I'd tell him to trust himself more," I said finally. "To stop worrying so much about what other people think, and to know that he's stronger than he realizes." Rachel smiled, reaching for my hand. "That's good advice. What about you?" I asked, squeezing her hand gently. She tilted her head, considering the question. "I'd tell her to stop trying to please everyone and to focus on what makes her happy. And to not be afraid of taking risks." I nodded, her words resonating with me. "Well, I think she turned out pretty great." Her laughter filled the room, warm and light. "And I think he did too." The holidays rolled around, bringing with them a whirlwind of family gatherings, work parties, and quiet moments by the fire. Rachel and I spent Christmas morning together, exchanging gifts and sipping hot cocoa. I'd bought her the pottery mug she'd admired at the market, along with a novel by her favorite author. She gave me a leather-bound journal and a framed photo of us from one of our hikes. "This is perfect," I said, running my fingers over the smooth leather of the journal. "Thank you. I thought you might like it," she said, her eyes bright. "You've been talking about wanting to write more." I smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I love it, and I love you." The day felt like something out of a movie, simple, joyful, and full of love. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder or dwelling on what I'd lost. I was fully present, and it felt like a gift in itself. As the new year approached, Rachel and I talked about our hopes and plans for the future. She was serious about opening her bookstore cafe and had started looking into potential locations. I encouraged her every step of the way, thrilled to see her chasing her dream. You know, she said one evening, her voice teasing, if you ever get tired of your job, you could come work for me. You'd make a great barista. I laughed, shaking my head. I'll keep that in mind, but only if I get free pastries. Deal, she said, grinning. As the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, we stood on her balcony, watching fireworks light up the sky. She leaned into me, her breath visible in the cold night air. This is going to be our year, she said, her voice full of quiet determination. It is, I agreed, pulling her close. And I can't wait to spend it with you. In that moment, surrounded by the crackle of fireworks and the warmth of her embrace, I realized something. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was creating something entirely new, something better than I ever could have imagined. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The new year brought with it a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in ages. With Rachel by my side, I felt like I was moving forward, not away from my past, but towards something brighter. The weight I'd carried for so long had lifted, replaced by the quiet joy of building a life I could truly call my own. Rachel's dream of opening her bookstore cafe quickly became a shared project. Though I had no business experience beyond my IT job, I found myself poring over location maps, running numbers and brainstorming names with her late into the night. What about the wandering mug? I suggested one evening, leaning back on her couch with a cup of tea. Rachel wrinkled her nose, laughing. Sounds like a lost coffee cup. Fair point, I admitted. What's your favorite idea so far? She tapped her chin, her eyes lighting up. Turn the page. It's simple, but it feels right, doesn't it? I smiled, reaching for her hand. It's perfect. We found the ideal spot in a charming little neighborhood, a corner space with large windows and plenty of natural light. Renovations began in early spring, and watching Rachel bring her vision to life was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Her passion and creativity were contagious, and I loved seeing her thrive. As for me, I found myself picking up old hobbies I'd neglected during my marriage. I started writing again, filling the journal Rachel had given me with thoughts, short stories, and the occasional poem. It felt good to rediscover that part of myself, to create something purely for the joy of it. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, Rachel joined me, holding 2 glasses of wine. She handed me one, then leaned on the railing, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. You seem lighter these days, she said, her voice soft. Happier. I am, I said, turning to look at her. And that's because of you. She smiled, setting her glass down and taking my hands in hers. You've done so much for me, James. More than I ever expected. But there's one thing I need to say. What's that? I asked, my chest tightening slightly. I need you to know how proud I am of you, she said, her voice steady. For everything you've been through, and for the way you've rebuilt your life. You're stronger than you realize. Her words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Finally, I squeezed her hands and said, that means more to me than I can put into words. By the time summer arrived, Rachel's cafe was ready to open. The grand opening was a whirlwind of excitement, with friends, family, and curious locals stopping by to browse the bookshelves and sample the menu. Rachel was in her element, greeting customers with her warm smile and infectious enthusiasm. I stood behind the counter, helping serve coffee and pastries, and watching her work filled me with a pride I hadn't felt in a long time. This was her dream, and seeing it come to life was a reminder of how far we'd both come. That evening, after the last customer had left and the cafe was quiet, Rachel and I sat at one of the corner tables, sipping wine and soaking it all in. We did it, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. You did it, I corrected, smiling. I just followed your lead. She reached across the table, taking my hand. We're a good team, aren't we? The best, I said, squeezing her hand. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected email from Emily. It was short and simple, a message of gratitude. James, I just wanted to thank you for everything, for the time we shared, for the lessons I learned, and for showing me how to move forward. I'm doing better now, and I hope you are too. Take care, Emily. I stared at the message for a long moment, then closed my laptop without replying. I didn't need to respond. Her words were enough, a quiet, final goodbye to a chapter that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. As the year went on, life settled into a rhythm I loved. I split my time between my job, helping Rachel at the cafe, and pursuing my own creative projects. Weekends were spent hiking, exploring new places, or simply enjoying quiet evenings together. One evening, as we sat on the porch of the cabin we'd rented for another weekend getaway, Rachel leaned against me, her voice quiet but certain. "This feels like home," she said. "It does," I agreed, wrapping an arm around her. "Wherever you are feels like home." She looked up at me, her eyes shining. "You mean that?" "Every word," I said. In that moment, I realized just how much my life had changed. I wasn't the same man who had packed up and vanished after discovering his wife's affair. That man had been broken, lost, and unsure of his future. But now I was whole. I was happy, and I was ready for whatever came next.